And now it is our pleasure to invite our visiting scholar, Rabbi Eric Yoffie, to the virtual bima. And this good idea came from Carol and Jay Sterling, and we thank them for the thought to make Shabbat Hagadol uplifted and magnified through the teaching of their friend, Rabbi Eric Yoffie, who is the President Emeritus of the Union for Reform Judaism, which represents 1.5 million Reform Jews in more than 900 synagogues across the United States and Canada. And of course, Holy Blossom Temple is one of the flagship congregations of the URJ. During his presidency, Rabbi Yoffie spearheaded initiatives to intensify Torah study and adult Jewish literacy, to expand the URJ summer camping system, of which our own Camp George is a part, to foster joyful Shabbat observance like ours, to create new interfaith initiatives with both Christians and Muslims. And I see the chair of our interfaith committee, Kalman Green, is here this Shabbat, together with Sheila Smolkin and others. They invite you to our upcoming Interfaith Seder. Rabbi Yoffie has met frequently with elected officials in Israel and throughout North America, working tirelessly on behalf of the Jewish state and for the rights of Reform Jews in Israel. Today, he is a sought-after speaker and a regular contributor to journals like Time and Haaretz in Israel, the Huffington Post, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, Commentary Magazine, Mosaic, and The Forward. Rabbi Yoffie is a true friend of Holy Blossom Temple, and it is wonderful to welcome him back to teach us this Shabbat, even if only with the help of technology. Rabbi Yoffie, Baruch haba.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I thank Rabbi Splansky for her words. She is a wonderful rabbi. She is immersed in Torah, and she is the heart and soul of Holy Blossom. I only hope you appreciate how fortunate you are to have her. I am honored to be speaking on the occasion of Abigail's bat mitzvah. What an extraordinary job she did. And also to be here when you first meet Rabbis Kay and McCarroll. Their job will be to appreciate how blessed they are to serve this great congregation. Your job will be to support and guide them as they take on their new responsibilities. And now to my job, which is to say a few words this morning about how we relate to the state of Israel in these difficult times. It seems fitting to do so on Shabbat HaGadol as we prepare for Pesach. Next week at our Seder, we will sing Kama Ma'alot, better known as Dayenu. It is a song in which we offer thanks for the great things that God has done for us. It begins with, if God had only brought us out of Egypt, that would have been enough. And then later, if God had only given us the Torah, that would have been enough. And finally, if God had only brought us to the land of Israel, that would have been enough. Redemption in Egypt, receiving the Torah, entering the land of Israel. What started at the first Passover went through Sinai and ended in Eretz Yisrael. From Egypt to Sinai to Jerusalem. That is the great drama of Jewish history, the foundation on which all else rests. And 3,200 years later, I suggest, our ties to the land of Israel and to the country that governs there today in the name of the Jewish people remain unbroken and in many respects undiminished. I am not naive. I know that there are Jews who find it difficult to embrace Israel in quite the same way as they once did. Many oppose Israel's Orthodox religious establishment, and I'll have more to say about that later. Many are concerned about radical settlers and the millions of Palestinians who live in the West Bank under Israeli control. The occupation will not end anytime soon because Hamas is a reality, and terror is a reality, as we know from the terrible events of recent weeks. And too many Palestinians have chosen a murderous path. But eventually, It will end. It must end if Israel is to remain a Jewish and democratic state. But does all this turmoil mean that North American Jews are drifting away from Israel? Not at all. Problems? Yes. Fierce disagreements? Definitely. But are we forsaking Israel? Absolutely not. There's a massive amount of data on this subject. We don't have time to run through all the numbers. But the heart of the matter is that more than 3/4 of Jews in North America say that caring about Israel is important or essential to their Jewish being. And while older Jews are more attached to Israel than younger ones, the numbers for younger Jews, thanks to birthright, are promising as well. And this too. Attachment to Israel is strong despite the fact that many of us disagree with the policies of Israel's government. Roughly half of us question whether Israel is making a sincere effort to bring about peace, and even more say that settlement building hurts Israel's security. Many people are perplexed by these numbers. How can it be that so many North American Jews oppose Israel's policies but support Israel? Part of the reason may be that we Jews are a contentious people. Some say the reason we survive is to finish the argument. But that aside, these numbers do not surprise me. In fact, they reassure me. Jews in Canada and the US know how to make reasonable distinctions. We are perfectly capable of opposing a particular government of Israel or a particular policy of Israel while remaining closely tied to the Jewish state. And that is exactly how it should be. But now the next question. Why do we care at all? How do we account for our intense identification with a tiny, embattled country on the other side of the world? I cannot answer for everyone, but I can answer for myself. Perhaps some of you will agree. I would start with this. I see Israel's existence as a miracle that inspires in me awe and thanksgiving. To some degree, this is a theological statement. God has chosen us and returned us to the mountains of Zion. And by virtue of God's actions, Israel has cast us into history, giving the Jewish people visibility, but also vulnerability. But in the most practical sense, Israel is simply a human miracle. 74 years ago, when Israel came into being, she was surrounded by enemies, had minimal arms, and only 600,000 people, a mixture of Zionist pioneers and desperate Holocaust survivors. America recognized Israel, but provided no weaponry. President Truman was supportive, but Secretary of State Marshall was not. David Ben-Gurion, who proclaimed the state on May 14, 1948, watched as young Jews danced in the streets, but he refused to celebrate himself because, he said, he knew what was coming the next day. And he was right. The very next day, 5 Arab nations invaded, and 1% of Israel's population was killed in the war that follows. But the war was eventually won, and then in the next 70 plus years, Israelis built a state out of nothing. They started with a defense capability to guarantee their survival. In the first 25 years, they invested in a nuclear reactor and created a standing army for conventional deterrence. In the next 25 years, they built a thriving economy, a high-tech economy so impressive that it was barely touched by the recent pandemic and the 2008 crash. And today, Israel is a country of almost 9 million people with almost 7 million Jews. It is the 22nd richest country on the planet. On the life satisfaction index of the OECD, the so-called happiness index, Israel ranks 9th. Canada ranks 15th. And the US ranks 16th. So my point is that when Israel slips from my mind, or when I get angry with Israel, I remind myself of the Israeli miracle. Life in Israel is good. Israelis are happier than Canadians and Americans. and live longer than we do. In only 74 years, Israel has provided a satisfying life to her 9 million inhabitants, Jews and Arabs alike. Arguably, this is her greatest accomplishment. The second reason that I care so deeply about Israel is that I believe in Jewish power. And Israel is the only place in the world where Jews exercise power. Canadian Jews have influence. American Jews have influence. Having influence means that if Jews anywhere are in distress, we go to our governments and try to convince them to act. Sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't. But having power means that Israel has an army, and it can send that army to Entebbe or Ethiopia or anywhere else in the world. And since its government is a Jewish government, it can provide refuge to any Jew seeking refuge at any time, for any reason, no questions asked. There are no prime ministers or presidents to be lobbied or nativists to be overcome. I'm an American, and I know that American Jewish influence is very important. But as a Jew, I recognize that a Jewish army and a Jewish government are critical for Jewish survival. Because if the Jewish people are to be masters of their own destiny, then Jews must achieve power and master the gun. Some Jews have trouble with this idea, especially liberal Jews like me. We are uncomfortable with power. But the fact is that without power, all other Jewish values can be turned to dust. Of course, having power sometimes means misusing power, and Israel has been guilty of that. But having power is far better than being powerless in a dangerous world. And if you doubt the importance of these matters, look at the world right now. We all watch with anguish the terrible suffering that Russian forces are inflicting on Ukraine. And we pray that the upcoming Pesach holiday will bring its message of redemption and freedom to Ukraine and all its citizens. But this too, with war raging and Europe's future uncertain, we worry about the Jews. There are 2.5 million Jews in Europe today, and not a single Jewish community there is truly secure. Not one. Many pray in camouflage synagogues, protected by soldiers armed with machine guns. In a survey released last year, 51% of European Jews said they're afraid to wear any jewelry or ritual object that identifies them as Jewish. In other words, no kippot or Jewish stars. During the last wave of anti-Semitism in France, 14,000 French Jews left for Israel. About 20,000 Ukrainians have already arrived in Israel. When the next crisis develops in France or England or Russia or Poland or Hungary, and when the neo-fascist parties in those places join the government, and when the population turns against the Jews, who will take them in if they decide to flee? Can we count on Canada to do so? Perhaps so, in some measure. I can't answer that question. We certainly cannot count on the U.S. But the answer to my question, of course, is that Israel will take them in. There is no one else that can be absolutely relied on. Israel was created for this purpose, among others, and the benefits of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish power have rarely been so apparent as they are today. Now, the third reason that I care so much about Israel is that I'm deeply moved by the spiritual potential of the Jewish state. Yes, Israel was created in part to assure the physical survival of Jews. We've just talked about that. But Israel was also created to nurture the Jewish people religiously, to revive Yiddishkeit, and to bring about a moral and spiritual renaissance for Jews everywhere. And that is a process that has begun, however imperfectly. We Jews in Canada and the U.S. should not see ourselves as inferior in the religious realm. We are small minorities in our countries, but are success stories, Jewishly vibrant, creative, and diverse. But Israel, by virtue of having a Jewish majority, provides what we cannot, and immersive Judaism, that is, a public Judaism rooted in a majority Jewish culture. Israel is the one place in the world where Judaism belongs in the public domain, where Hebrew is the language of every day, where Shabbat and the festivals provide the rhythm of the calendar, and where the public square is dominated by Jewish arguments. Again, none of this means we cannot live a full Jewish life in Canada or in America. It's not that Israel offers a better Jewish model, but it offers a different Jewish model with all of the benefits that majority status provides. Now, I admit when it comes to developing religious models that are symbiotic and reciprocal, Israelis and North American Jews have a long way to go. We have yet to find a common religious language. Israel's task is to embrace all Jews and to strengthen every movement in Judaism that is fighting to keep the idea of Torah alive. And it has not done that. Will there be a Palestinian state is a very important question. But an equally important question is, will there be a Jewish state? A state that works in true partnership with Jews of the world, that relates to all Jews with respect. As of now, such a state does not exist because of an Orthodox chief rabbinate that makes us feel unwelcome in our spiritual home. I understand that many Reform Jews are angry that our Judaism is not embraced in Israel. I'm pretty angry myself. But I cannot understand those who say, we North American Jews do not need Israel. You've probably heard this argument. It goes like this. We don't like the way that Israel's government treats us. We don't like the fact they don't recognize our rabbis. We don't like some of Israel's leaders who don't show us respect. And maybe we aren't happy with their policy on the Palestinians. All points worthy of consideration. And so they continue, why bother with Israel? We have our own Jewish community that is strong and can go its own way. But my response to these outbursts is this. You are wrong. In Canada and America, we Jews cannot go it alone. If you have criticisms of Israel, that's fine. Get in line. Israel is not Disneyland and it's not summer camp. We Jews are a family and families fight. And if you want to join in that fight, you are welcome to do so. In fact, you are encouraged to do so. Israel is not primarily the state of the Israelis, it is the state of the Jewish people. And that means that we get a say. We don't get to decide, but we get a say. As Rabbi David Hartman used to tell us, Israel is far too important to be left to Israelis. And if you're unhappy with Israel's leaders, I have news for you. Only a confirmed anti-Semite believes that Israel has the leadership she deserves. But this is the key. For all our bickering, we cannot go it alone, and neither can Israel. We Jews are a tiny people. There are 14.5 million Jews in the world today. This is a smaller figure than a rounding error in the Chinese census. And the great majority are in Israel and North America. So the idea that either of us could survive without the other is absurd. And remember that Israel needs us. In fact, it needs us now more than ever. Without us, it would not have come into being. It would not be strong. And it still requires our political activism, our financial support, and our frequent visits. And it requires us to answer the lies and distortions of the Israel haters, including the self-haters in our midst, to see the rights of every group except their own. But not only that, I suggest that Israel especially needs what we Reform Jews have to offer. Why does the Orthodox establishment fear and despise us? Because of what we bring to the always percolating Israeli stew. Israel needs our experience with pluralism, with bridge building, with sustaining religious freedom for all, not to mention our energy and our passion for justice. And on the other hand, Reform Jews need Israel because it is a place that inspires us and it pumps the dynamism of Jewish life through our veins. Because we are living at a moment when a sovereign Jewish nation has been established in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. and we are blessed to play a part in shaping its Jewish character and Jewish soul. Because the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in its ancient homeland is one of the most moral causes of our time, and it is a cause that we defend with pride. Taken separately, North American Jews and Israeli Jews are no more than a footnote in history, each smaller than the population of Quebec. But together, we are a single people, linked by covenant and history, implicated in each other's fate and destiny. In the global world in which we live, North American and Israeli Jews are a single political system. We do not agree on many things, but we must deal with them together. And while disagreeing with each other is fine, distancing yourself from Israel for any reason whatsoever is Jewishly unacceptable. It flies in the face of everything that we know about Jewish commitment, Jewish thought, and Jewish history. The bottom line is this: Jewish life cannot be sustained without Israel at its core, and Israel cannot be sustained without the Jewish people at its side. And so I leave you with this. What we need to do is remember that our love for Israel is unconditional, but not uncritical. And this is complicated. When we're dealing with Israel, we must engage complexity and avoid whitewashing. We must feel free to be critics, but connected critics. We must be more assertive when Israel is right and more honest when Israel is wrong. But it is love that must always predominate. Israel is a good country in a bad neighborhood, where most of the time, the best impulses of her leaders and her people determine the direction of the state. Israel's pain is our pain, her safety, our gladness. And we are now and always lovers of Israel in the old-fashioned way, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, until death do us part. So help us God. Shabbat Shalom.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi Yoffie, it is so good to hear your leading voice again, ringing in this sanctuary built by your predecessor, Rabbi Eisendrath, who went on from this congregation to be president of the URJ. You are a clarifying voice. You are a champion of Reform Judaism and Reform Zionism. Here at Holy Blossom, one of our 6 pillars is Ahavat Yisrael, a love for Israel. And so we join with you once again in this prayer, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir v'nizkeh chulanu mehera le'oro. May the Holy One bless us with a new light, causing a new light to shine upon Zion, and let us all soon be worthy of its light. We look forward to the day that we can invite you back to Holy Blossom and being here in person in Toronto, so we can shake your hand and continue the conversation. Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi Yoffie.